Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. One of the most famous and influential people in the conservative movement in 2021 is named Charlie Kirk. He's the founder and the president of Turning Point USA. He is a profoundly effective organizer, but he's also an intellectual. He thinks about ideas, he cares about them, and some of his ideas have changed recently. We thought it'd be worth sitting down with him and asking him what he's thinking now. Charlie Kirk joins us. Charlie, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you. Thank you.
So this is not a formal category, but in my head, I'm trying to seek out and interview people who didn't complete college. Because I'm just interested in people who took a different path from the normally prescribed path. And I think you're the first person we've interviewed who didn't go to college at all.
That's right.
So I can tell you don't like talking about yourself, but just for the instruction of the rest of us, tell us about your journey to where you are now.
Yeah, it's an unusual path. I always thought I was going to go to college. The worst thing you could possibly do where I grew up was not go to college.
Where'd you
Drugs, suburbs of Chicago.
Yeah.
So like drugs, alcoholism, like we can deal with that. Like we have a playbook for that, kind of going missing for a couple days or going up to Lake Geneva and kind of going on a bender with your friends.
Right. Going out to Minnesota for rehab.
Of course, fine. We've dealt with that before, but kind of a kid who's in the top 5% of your high school who did sports, was an Eagle Scout, not going to college, fire alarm.
Oh, so you did well in high school.
Yeah, I wasn't the first in class, but AP classes, and I was.
So you were on the college track.
Oh yeah, I mean I was in the meetings with the high school counselors where it was not a matter of if I was going to college, it's what college was I going to, because almost every single metric that the school district used as a way to gauge success was how many kids are we getting into 4 universities.
Right.
And so the whole community that I grew up in was just programmed to believe that 4-year university was the only way. It was the ticket to success. And so I wanted to go to West Point, and I didn't get in. Ended up being a really good thing that happened to me. That didn't happen to me, actually. And I just kind of told my parents, like, look, I'm going to take a gap year and try to figure out my place in this world. I don't want to go borrow $70,000 to go to some school that I really don't have very much connection to or passion about. And it's been about 9 gap years. And here we
so
are.
What did you do for your gap year? You didn't hike in Laos, obviously.
No, I didn't do that. Nor did I explore, the biodiversity of Somalia or whatever some of these kids do when they're given these, like, there's this idea of a gap year where you're supposed to explore the world. I didn't do that. I just told my parents, look, I have a deep passion for our country. I started the organization that, obviously I do all our work now through Turning Point USA with no money, no connections, and no idea what I was doing.
At what age?
18. Yeah.
Well, how did that come to you? Most 18-year-olds are not starting their own 501c3s, their own organizations.
I wish it was kind of like this moment where I said I was sitting under, the tree and the apple came down and I discovered the gravitational laws of, of the universe. It wasn't that simple. It was just, I just had a passion. I just started speaking locally at Republican groups and Tea Party groups. And I realized that my generation was being not correctly informed on these issues of our nation and our culture. And I've grown a lot on those issues over the last 5 years, and I really would love to explore that. But basically in 2012, when I started this, it was, especially in the suburbs of Chicago, it was, you must love Barack Obama or else, you're a terrible person. I always took exception to that. Had some great mentors and people that believed in me. Some of them as well. Foster Freeze, great guy, and he's terrific. And he kind of saw the vision, and it was kind of clumsy at first because I didn't really understand. I didn't know how to do payroll, let alone run an organization, let alone grow something. But I learned along the way and started to get a better grasp of these ideas. And, it was a great thing that I never went to college.
So the reason, I'll just be totally blunt with you, the reason I want to talk to you is not because you're obviously a great organizer, you're a very effective speaker, I've seen it a couple times, and you're a great fundraiser. Those are all kind of political skills, which I respect, but we see them a lot. What I didn't realize until recently was that you are an active thinker and you're really interested in ideas. I don't know how that went completely over my head, but it's true. We had this long, kind of amazing dinner together last month, and my view of you completely changed. So tell us about your intellectual journey.
Yes.
And I don't mean that in a patronizing way, just a sincere way. Someone who covers politicians, I see a certain skill set, but always lacking from that skill set is like an interest in the ideas. But you have that.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. I started in the conservative movement when it was dominated by libertarianism.
Yes.
And I read everything. So I've always loved ideas, but I felt myself in this handcuff of abstractions, that everything would always go back to just some repeated dogma.
Yes.
So I read Hayek and Mises and Rothbard. And I think there's some very interesting things we can glean from their literature. However, there was always this conclusion of this reversion to ideology. And the only way to beat an ideologue is with another ideologue. And so 2013, 14, 15, the conservative movement was knitted together very similarly as in the 1980s as being almost an anti-Soviet, anti-Obama conservative movement.
Yes.
We don't like the Soviets. We don't like Obama. We'll get the libertarians and conservatives and neocons in one room, and we can all agree that we need to get rid of Obama, or we need to get rid of the Soviets. And then in 2015 and 2016, as we were trying to select a candidate, there was finally this robust discussion that, quite honestly, I was unprepared for, of what exactly does it mean to be a conservative? And this kind of balance between permanence and progression was something I never really thought deeply about. Are we just going to be managing progress as conservatives, or are we going to be able to say, no, there are some things that should not change, that we should, as Edmund Burke said, be very clear about this three-tied knot of those that came before us, the living, and those who have yet to be born. And I never thought I don't want to say deeply, but I really never encountered these ideas in a way that was profound to me. And in 17, 18, and 19, as those ideas started...
Well, you didn't, I suppose, because as you just said, you didn't really have to. None of us really had to, because conservatism was purely a reaction against these other movements. So there wasn't a need to kind of figure out what you were for.
Yeah, and the people that dominated the conversation, now that I have realized, were either heavily influenced by corporate America that wanted the conservative movement to just revert to abstractions and ideology for the lack of interference from the state towards their kind of corporate tyranny, which I'd love to explore with you.
Yes.
And this kind of thought also, it lends itself towards, not necessarily away from partisanship, but it gets towards a more nuanced and, dare I say, a more thoughtful conservative movement in the sense that we are unafraid to say, you know what, maybe I agree with Bernie Sanders' immigration policy when he used to talk about it in 2004. Maybe mass immigration shouldn't be the most important thing that conservatives should always stand for. And I believe, and Russell Kirk predicted this, that as soon as the Soviet Union fell, the conservative movement in America wouldn't know what to do with themselves.
Right. And
he predicted this almost to the date and time. So the Berlin Wall falls. And this is what I call the four horsemen of the 90s. And this is when I was born in 93. So all this was happening while I had basically no say about it, where the generation that did so well, the older baby boomers and kind of the George H.W. Bush, Irving Kristol generation,
right,
they were in the prime of their political career. And so what did they decide to do as soon as the Berlin Wall fell? And almost to the date, Russell Kirk was right. Mass immigration in 1990, George H.W. Bush signed in this compromise with Ted Kennedy to bring in millions of people, unrestricted, into our nation, of this great bargain of cheap labor and then cheap votes. So both sides kind of got a win out of that. 1994, Bill Clinton signs NAFTA because we decided it would be a good idea to deindustrialize the backbone of our nation. And then 1999, one that might surprise people, that as a conservative I think we should find disgusting, was the repeal of Glass-Steagall. Was when Bill Clinton went out of his way to pander to the financial services lobby that largely led to cheap money and I think the blurring of lines between commercial banking and investment banking. And then finally, China's entrance into the World Trade Organization in 2001.
Right.
And all four of those things, I believe, was the conservative movement or the people in charge chasing momentary pleasure and not preserving the good, with no commitment to permanence or to trying to pass something that has worked, that is moral and beautiful to my generation.
I completely agree. I was there for all of that. I was a conservative. I was a writer during all the moments you just mentioned. I missed all four of them, completely missed them. There was a sense that they were important. You could kind of feel that like things were about to change, but there was nobody other than Pat Buchanan and to some extent Ross Perot standing up and saying maybe this is a bad idea. And those two were attacked by me in part as crazy, as bigots or whatever. I mean, they really were kicked out of the conservative movement.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think because this kind of neoliberal bipartisan consensus was really, I would say, clever in a clever fashion, protected by good, not somewhat good intentions, but also if you dare criticize us, you're a bad person.
Right.
So I remember being in 4th grade, and one of my classmates, who had more wisdom than I did, asked my teacher, "Hey, is it a good thing that everything's made in China?" 4th grade. And my teacher said yes. And there was almost this charitable explanation that if you care about the people of the world, then you're going to want all this plastic imported from Wuhan.
Right.
And as I look back to that moment, I realized that the people that actually had really bad intentions, that were designing just momentary corporate profit for no regard for the nation at all, so looking at America as a colony, not as a country, they swatted down any opposition by saying you're a bad person.
Yes, that's right.
And immediately going to virtue signaling, all signaling no virtue, and going to moralizing, and no sort of conversation was ever allowed to happen about this. And so what I think is really healthy, though, is that finally these ideas are back in the forefront. And you're right, Ross Perot did very well because he actually talked about the sucking noise of Mexico stealing our jobs. He talked about middle-class work. He talked about the muscular class. Pat Buchanan did as well. And it wasn't until Donald Trump came on the scene that any of these ideas were given a fair hearing, in my opinion.
It struck me the other day that China is powerful because it has a manufacturing economy.
Of course.
Of course. It's so interesting, though. I mean, China's not beating us at the highest levels of tech. China's beating us because they make televisions and they make physical, tangible goods that we used to make.
Yes, and so there was this great bargain that was done. Bargain's even a terrible word for it. There was a deal. And the promise was, okay, we're going to just basically eliminate 15 million jobs almost instantaneously for the sake of bringing in a bunch of plastic so that you're going to be able to have more stuff that you really have no regard for. And so when I drive through these small towns, Tucker, and my wife, when I travel, it's kind of this running joke. I count in a 1 hour spread how many Dollar Generals and Family Dollars there are.
Yeah.
And for me, that might as well be a Chinese embassy. Yeah. So you get a dollar product that's going to fall apart in 6 months that you don't even remember you bought. But then what was the cost of that? And so in economics, we were always told that's the most important thing to order society. And I'm not saying economics are unimportant, but economics is a science. You can't really derive morality from it. And so when you only organize your society based on cost of goods, then you should ask yourself the question, well, what's the cost of this society? And so we had these macroeconomics economists organize our society saying that the importation of goods and making nothing domestically will actually make us richer. So now it's a question, as we're in 2021, is that really the case? And the answer is absolutely no. Families are decaying, church attendance is down, opioid use is up, alcoholism is up. And what used to be the defining quality of America, which is not Wall Street or Hollywood or any of that nonsense. No, it was the ability that we had people earning $15 to $20 an hour, a living wage at the time, being able to raise a family of 4 to 5 children, if they so choose, and they made stuff with their hands, so they actually saw the reward at their work.
Right.
So now we have an overemphasis on the technological economy, an overemphasis on the information economy, and basically it's this massive labor arbitrage that I think has made us poor, not just economically, but it's made us poor spiritually, it's made us poor culturally.
Probably should have started this way, but I'm going to move a couple paragraphs back and ask you, what are the things that conservatism in 2021 should be defending? What is the point of a conservative movement?
I think a transcendent order is critical.
A transcendent order.
Yeah, and I didn't come up with it. That's Russell Kirk's words, so I have no connection, but I do share a last name, so I'm somewhat partial. And Edmund Burke talked about this before, which is that we're here for a purpose. And that, I'm a religious person, and I believe that our rights are given to us from a creator, and that we're made in his image. That's not to say that atheists have no place in the conservative movement, or the a-religious do. But I don't think society is sustainable without things that anchor us to the true purpose of why we're here. And the second of which then is the family. Now, mind you, I skipped over the individual because I think an overemphasis on individualism has been very unhealthy for conservatism. I think that individualism has its purpose in Lockean philosophy, but I also think there's excesses. So the family is, in my opinion, the one institution that we can point to that has stood the test of time next to maybe religion.
Yeah.
And what we've done through our economics and through our school system and through college and through our public policy decisions, we have basically said the family is either optional or an annoyance, or maybe if you want to build a family, you can have children and the state will raise your children for you. And I think we're starting to see the limitations of that kind of postmodern vision of whatever the family should be. And so I think as conservatives, we should then say we stand for transcendent order, for strong and robust and large families, and Americans being born in our nation, reversing the trend of a declining American birth rate, and then community. That's a word that conservatives don't like to talk about because it kind of feels almost collectivistic, right? Anything that has commune or community, we tend to say, oh, no, we don't like that. I'm just going to be my own person and I'm going to be driven by ambition solely and completely. Well, I think that there's this kind of yearning. And if I could just do a side note here, one of the reasons why I think that we're about to live through something rather significant is the number one piece of feedback I receive from smart people is this nonstop repetition of nostalgia. And I think
What does that mean?
Things used to be better 10 years ago. Things used to be better 20 years ago.
You hear people say that.
All the time.
Yeah.
And there's almost this bipartisan agreement, no matter who you talk to, that things were better before. And nostalgia is a natural thing for human beings to demand, right? Because there's always this kind of idea of like my memories were best. But when it's so repeated, when it's so in front of us, that should be a fire alarm. That maybe modernity has its limitations, and maybe we need things that we need to anchor ourselves to.
Right.
And I think that conservatives should also be unafraid to defend the ancient and the beautiful and the wonder. And what is beauty? I mean, have we even had that conversation as conservatives lately? Of course not. Beauty is that which is perfected in being and glorifies the good. And you don't find many politicians that ever talk about these things because it won't get them reelected, or maybe they haven't thought about it. I don't know. But you look, for example, and I know you and I share a passion about art, which is not exactly something that conservatives care much about. I joke around the largest open art exhibit for postmodernism in San Francisco. Because everything you see on the streets of San Francisco 20 years ago was in an art exhibit. Chaos, disorder, and the destruction of purpose.
Yeah.
It's now just bled over into the streets. And so conservatives should be unafraid to say that we want to pursue the good.
So when you see a junkie on the sidewalk on Market Street lying in a puddle of his own urine, that's a kind of art installation.
I mean, I think back to the 1960s when a pile of excrement was submitted as art.
Right.
In some sort of postmodern museum in Paris or New York, and the ruling class fawned over that. Or I think of the signed urinal in the 1920s.
That's right.
I think art is a
Marcel Duchamp, the beginning of Dada.
Precisely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of wonder then why. I mean, let's just take it to a really tangible level. You mentioned Dollar General.
Yes.
The ubiquitous dollar store, the marker of rural poverty, right? Is the
Bingo.
dollar store, I would say. You got to wonder why conservatives haven't fought back against that. Like even at the level of commercial real estate, a dollar store is ugly. It sells ugly products. It is, of course, a parasite on rural sadness, right?
Totally.
Right. The percentage of people at the dollar store who are on some kind of federal or state aid is probably overwhelming. So, why would you be for that? Why, if you live in a community and someone says, I want to build a dollar store, on the main drag, why wouldn't you say, no, you can't?
Well, because I think that...
I don't think a conservative would ever say that.
And I think they will, because conversations like this have finally been liberated from the false framework that all of our discussions were taking place, where we had this, newspeak simulation that we've been operating in. No, I love corporate growth at all times. Really, do you? You want every single human being to go to a Dollar General and a Family Dollar so that the ruling class can have 6 yachts in Kennebunkport? I think that's a bad bargain. Bad deal. But let me tell you this. Here's why. I think that we're stuck in the muscle memory of the conversations of the 90s and early 2000s. So you know who used to say that Dollar General and Family Dollar used to be bad? It was the Democrats.
Yeah, I know.
So I was just recently in Whitefish, Montana. I love Whitefish, Montana.
Me too.
So I was just exiting Whitefish, Montana, and my driver, and I pointed, I said, oh, there's a Starbucks. She said, you know what's unique about that Starbucks? I said, what? She said, there's the county line. We don't let corporate in Whitefish, Montana. I said, oh, that's why I love it here.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny because this is why I have a soft spot for environmentalists. I don't like their conclusions. I don't like their war on energy. But I think it's actually admirable to want to preserve something.
Of course. I agree.
I think that's beautiful, that something works. You want your children to enjoy it as you do. You want permanence, not progression for the sake of progression, as Lord Falkland would say. If it's not necessary to change, it's necessary not to change. That this cult of progress is actually maddening. It creates this fanaticism of chaos, in my personal opinion, because I think human beings need permanence to anchor us. But one of the reasons why conservatives haven't rejected that is the muscle memory of discussions of past. We need to break ourselves out of that. I mean, these conversations really have an impact. And number two, there is this belief in conservatism that we don't want to be anti-development. And I'm not really sure where this came from. The only explanation I have is the over-excess or indulgence in individualism and kind of this urbanization push. That
maybe if you take a lot of money from developers, you're for development.
I think that's probably right. And so, for example, I'm not running for anything, so I'm free.
Yeah.
So I think we should have height limitations on buildings in our country.
Well, of course.
I think the higher the buildings go, the less you are to own, to be actually in contact with the land that we should care about. And so there's a direct correlation with how high the buildings are and how little you love your country. It's the tragedy of the commons.
I completely agree with that. How about this, just as a kind of framework going forward? If it's ugly and dehumanizing, we're against it.
Yeah, and I think we have to be clear of what is ugly. And that's and what is beautiful. And so I do this with college kids all the time because they never have these conversations, right? They're just kind of stuck in this oppressor-oppressed, really kind of boring debate.
Very boring.
And it's maddening, and it creates deeply unhappy activists, which is exactly what our universities
and dumb
create.
people, by the way.
Correct. And so then conservatives play into this kind of oppressor-oppressed thing by not being able to deal with the guilt that they feel because they went to these universities.
Right.
I think guilt is the inability to deal with guilt, I think, is one of the larger driving forces in politics that no one wants to talk about.
I agree with that.
White guilt, corporate guilt, wealth guilt, unearned guilt. And so, however, what is the...
I'm sorry, that's such an interesting point. It's quickly flesh it out. Why does no one want to... I think you're absolutely right. It's taken the place of theology.
Totally.
Right? So a society without meaning will find meaning, and we found it in expiating our own guilt. But why will no one talk about that?
So I'm going to talk about the mechanics of Christianity, not what I believe is the divinity, because I do believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, and Jesus was a real person and died and rose from the dead. I'm going to talk about the mechanics of Christianity for a second, because we don't talk about this enough. A true Christian, after they go through either a church service or a deep reading of the Scriptures, I'm more evangelical in nature, you're freed from that guilt. Whatever guilt that might be, of wronging your neighbor or being of a certain complexion that society says you shouldn't be, because you go straight to the source of your Creator.
Right.
And so that's the mechanics of Christianity that have worked so well for the last couple thousand years, that you don't owe some penance to society because of the melanin content in your skin. So you remove the mechanics of Christianity, and every I don't want to say sect, but that's probably the right word, but every different denomination of Christianity has a different way to deal with this, right? So in Catholicism, it would be the taking of the Eucharist.
Right.
In the evangelical tradition, it would be worship, right? And so that's why those of us that are more in the evangelical world, 30 minutes of worship and being filled with the Holy Spirit and deeply reading the Scriptures will free us of any sort of earthly or material wrongdoing that we might have done in the last week. And then, of course, atoning to your neighbor, going to your neighbor and saying, you know what, I wronged you. Will you forgive me?
Right.
Then all of a sudden, you're kind of freed of that, whatever you might have done.
There's a formal process for offloading your guilt.
Totally.
So you don't need to offload it onto the society at large.
Yes. And so, again, this is something I've done a lot of writing about, and I'm just beginning to articulate, because I try to think a couple months before I say something out loud, which I really do believe that guilt is the driver of our politics right now.
Yes, I agree with that.
Of Republicans that introduce these ridiculous police reform bills because they feel guilty because they don't know how to deal with the accusations being thrown at them by the left, or the left that has no sort of belief in a transcendent order or the good or the beautiful. They offload their guilt through massive public policy measures, activism, the confiscation of wealth, and the elimination of private property. And so we as conservatives need to be very clear of what is beautiful. And even the most ardent atheist, I believe in small d democracy of beautiful. And I just kind of chuckle because there's a reason why everyone huddles on Santa Monica Beach 10 minutes before the sunset. Because there's an agreement that there's beauty in that.
Right, that's right.
Even the most fervent atheist, I mean, Christopher Hitchens would go and see that sunset.
Of course.
And so therefore, if there is an agreement that mountains and maybe untouched nature is beautiful, then there must be some order of the good. There has to be. And thankfully, there's been abundant amount of scholarship that's been done on this topic. And I think conservatives should be unafraid to talk about this.
I couldn't agree more. Everyone loves a puppy.
Of course.
Puppy. You look at a puppy's face; it's beautiful. Who knows why? But
yes.
I mean, it's actually not that much. I think you're exactly right. Debate about what is beautiful.
Yeah, and what is courage, right? So it's not being rash, and it's not being shy, and you can't be courageous unless you're afraid. But it's also standing up for those that can't stand up for themselves, or taking clear stances of when you might lose something.
It's just so interesting, the beauty thing, though. If you live in a world, I decided a few years ago I don't want to be around ugly, and I don't want to live in an ugly world because it's not good for you. So it's
really bad for your soul.
It is bad for your soul, and I don't do it anymore. But I've noticed that every time we do a segment on architecture, specifically, I'm interested in architecture just because...
My dad's an architect.
Oh, okay. Well,
and
good.
he agrees completely with your worldview on this.
Yeah, I mean, I live in America. I want to live around buildings that sort of elevate the landscape, that are tied in some sense to nature, that, make you cheerful and not despondent. I mean, just basic stuff. Every time we do a segment on that, the response is like, you're a Nazi! Really? What, because I don't like brutalism? Because I don't like concrete crap? I just want something pretty. In other words, they're hyper-aggressive about aesthetics. Hyper-aggressive.
Which means we're right over the
Exactly.
target.
Exactly. So why aren't conservatives every bit as aggressive back? Like, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to build a dollar store in my town. Sorry.
And
by the way, when they tried to cut the sequoias in Northern California in the 1980s, a radical environmental activist called Julia Butterfly Hill climbed to the top of one of them and said, you're not cutting down the redwood, sorry, because I love this tree. Why don't conservatives just kind of camp out on the building site of the next dollar store and say, I'm sorry, I'm not moving?
They will. I'm actually optimistic.
I hope they do.
They will. They're still trying to figure this all out, Tucker, because they're stuck in this kind of this I want to call it theater. I will call it theater of you receive money from a certain group of people, and you oppose socialism, and you oppose whatever the Democrats are doing. But then it's okay if there's Dollar General. It's okay that we have a 95-foot building, a 95-story building in Syracuse or, whatever town that they might represent. And this goes to what conservatism actually is, which I just have to say our leaders and many of the politicians haven't really figured this out. And that's okay. They will. That's the space you and I are in. That's why I do 2 podcasts a day and why our radio show is growing and why your show is flourishing, because there's depth to this conversation that, at least in the conservative movement I grew up in, none of this existed.
Yeah.
And this kind of discourse and this dialogue and this wrestling with these ideas. But I agree. I think that conservatives need to then they need to apply their agreement into action, which is the space that I basically live in, right? Which is not just, one of my favorite quotes is, I try not to just stare at the heavens because I'm afraid I'm going to fall in a well, right? If the overemphasis on just the ideas and not the application, then we just become a bunch of professors and academics, the philosopher kings that I really have a great deal of repulsion for, right? And so then it's like, okay,
because they're not good at their jobs.
Well, they're really bad at their jobs, and they're not even exposing kids to any of this stuff that we've just talked about.
Yeah.
And they also generally hate the country that
they
they're
do.
in.
I'm not against philosopher kings as a category. I'm just against bad ones, and we have some bad ones.
We have the worst.
So, I want to read you a couple tweets you sent recently, and I want to evaluate these against the backdrop of your job, which is, I think you're probably the biggest conservative organizer in the country. Is that fair to say? I don't know a bigger one.
I mean, I'm sure there's someone bigger, but
I don't think there is. And you raise a ton of money. And of course, most money comes from rich people. So when you tweet something like this, and I'm quoting, corporations are no friends to America. They are nothing more than massive college campuses with shareholders. Conservatives and Republicans should act accordingly. That was last month. So, you raise your money from people who presumably started corporations or work in them or benefit from them, shareholders of them. How does that go over?
Pretty well. I mean, our funding base at Turning Point is a lot of entrepreneurs, Midwestern-based, mid-sized businesses, 100 to 600 employees, done well. But even the donors that aren't in that category, some of them dropped off because I said that. I said, okay, that's fine. And our donor base at Turning Point's expanding through small dollar donations significantly. But Tucker, I'm kind of in a place where I really don't care. And I'm going to keep on saying things that are true. And then however the funding for our organization kind of plays out, so be it. I will say this, though, Tucker, that the donors to our organization are very concerned that there is this corporatist tyranny that is seeping into our country that does not reflect their viewpoint or their values, and they want something done about that.
Yeah.
And so it goes over rather positively.
So you said you can say this because you don't care, and I am totally convinced that's the key to freedom.
Yes.
Emancipate yourself from mental slavery, as Bob Marley said. And you can't emancipate yourself from it until you decide that the attacks, the bad faith attacks from people who hate you, have no power. Like, you have the key to that within yourself. I think this is true for all of us. So I think it's essential for people not to care about the attacks of people who have
totally agree.
No interest in them or the truth or even the meaning of words. How did you get to that? How did you get to not caring?
That's a really good question. It did come with the more I understand these ideas and the more I've thought about them and the more that I have decided where I am ordered in the nation. For example, my relationship with my wife matters a lot more than whatever, feedback I might receive from someone that might have given me money 5 years ago. It's way more important, right? Or my relationship with my creator. And so then properly ordering yourself, I think, is a very important thing.
Properly ordering yourself, creating a hierarchy of what's important in your life.
Yes. And I don't think enough people do that.
So tell me your order.
Well, first and foremost, my relationship with my creator.
Right.
With my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And then my relationship with my wife.
Yes.
And then my relationship with my nuclear family, my parents.
Yes.
And those that are in my kin, or my little platoon, if you will. Then my friends.
Yes.
And then from there, my profession or my work.
Where's Twitter on this list?
Very low. I actually deleted Twitter from my phone.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh,
I text my team my tweets. I deleted all social media. I think technology is destroying our humanity. And when I mean deleted social media, I didn't delete my accounts. I just deleted it from my phone. I let my team deal with it. I send them stuff to do.
Yeah. I don't have my Twitter password. And so, yes, I agree with you. So you just got married and you went on your honeymoon and you wrote what I thought was kind of a beautiful piece about getting away from technology for the week or 10 days you were abroad. What was that like?
Liberating.
So what did you do when you say you got away from technology? Like, be specific.
Phone off, handed it to my team, no computer, no news cycle, nothing.
For how long?
10 days.
So I don't know anyone who's done that in the last decade. I actually don't think I know a person who's done that.
I know one person. Dave Rubin does it every August.
Does he really? Good for Dave Rubin.
And that would be it.
So what happened?
Well, so first 48 hours, because I'm so used to, constantly picking that device, I kind of had to reorient myself in the natural world. But then after about 3 days, I realized that the smooth screen, as I call it, this little digital pacifier that we have around us, it's not just accelerating pre-existing behavior, it's creating new behavior altogether, which is something I'd love to explore with you. For example, at the innovation of the automobile, it was not designed to be addictive. It was designed to be useful. The iPhone in some ways was designed to be useful, but it was more designed to be addictive. Their entire model is, how do I manipulate your neuroscience so that you stare at the screen more? That's their obsession. They hire the premier neuroscientists in the world to fly into Menlo Park to Apple's headquarters, where they treat 6-year-olds like lab rats so that they can stare at their screen more. So on our honeymoon, I started to realize that this time I was spending with my wife, it was incredibly exclusive in the sense I looked to my right and everyone was texting and tweeting and Snapchatting where they were. I looked to my left, I said, no one gets to share this with me. It's ours. And it's always going to be ours. And the memories will always be within our soul and our spirit. Why would I want to take all these social media people along to my honeymoon with me? Their needs, their wants, their concerns, their urgent requests. That's sort of irrational. And
creepy.
Very creepy.
Yeah.
And so we saw this beautiful sunset in the Caribbean, and my wife and I were just enjoying every moment of it. The way the sun reflected off the water, the clouds that just danced across the sky. It was as beautiful as beauty gets, right? It's something that almost God spent extra time. This is a master stroke on the sky. And I looked to my right and looked to my left, and their eyes were not looking at the wonder around them, but down to the needs, wants, and concerns of some narcissist in New York City that wanted their attention. There's something deeply unhealthy about that.
So you're 27, you're a year older than my oldest child, weirdly. And so that means you've lived your whole adult life and part of your childhood with this technology.
That's correct.
When was the last time that you had 10 days without a screen?
When I was in high school. And I tell parents all the time, if you want to give the greatest gift to your child, don't give them a smartphone when they're in high school.
High school? I mean, but nobody waits till high school.
Well, I think 18. I think that they're more dangerous than AR-15s.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Completely.
I think we should treat this stuff like nuclear weaponry.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time shooting the AR-15. I've never, no bad effects at all.
No, but I say that intentionally because the left treats AR-15s like they're the most.
Oh, it's a great rifle, actually.
It's terrific.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more.
Love Armalite. But the point is that I think the phone is doing much more damage than AR-15s ever will.
So, yeah, I mean, I think the average family, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but gives some kind of smartphone or device, iPad, to kids like in 4th grade. So tell me about your brain and how you noticed more around you. You were more fully in the moment without the distraction of the screen. But as you noted, there's something about spending half your day staring into the screen that changes the way you think. Did you find yourself thinking a little differently?
More clearly.
More clearly.
And deeply. And there's a cloudiness that comes in when you're always staring into the portal. There's an inability to connect one thought to the other. It's always this kind of interrupted, immediate dinging and pinging and flashing in front of you. It's designed that way, by the way. It's designed to always be pushing towards you, as if you're just going to play the slot machine. Come on, maybe I'll get a text message that will make me feel good. Maybe I'll get an Instagram like that will make you feel good. So we have a lot of idle time as human beings. I noticed this on my honeymoon. Sometimes, I might be going to the restroom, just walking the property. I did something that I hadn't done since I was in high school. Just looked at the world around me.
Yeah.
Looked at other human beings. Just thought about what I believe and why I believe it. And I had the belief before I went on the honeymoon. I didn't just do this as a social experiment, let me be clear. I did this because nothing is more important outside of my relationship with my creator and my savior than my relationship with my wife. And so, absent something that is a 5-alarm fire, the phone's gone, right? So that was the kind of the properly ordering part. But I believe firmly that these devices are destroying our humanity. And I also believe that technology breeds tyranny, which is something that conservatives need to talk more about.
So you can't really be free if you possess an iPhone. I mean, the phone is, of course, tracking you. It's listening to you. Any conversation you have can be monitored. I mean, this sounded like Alex Jones stuff, who turned out to be completely right, by the way. No one says that, but it's true. But that's all actually happening. You can test it on your phone. So as long as you're dependent on the phone, you're not really capable of being free, are you?
Well, I don't want to say that there's not anyone that could probably master the device, but that's a general rule. And look, let me say this, that conservatives love citing Orwell. So I reread 1984 on my honeymoon in like literally 5 hours. And I blitzed through it because I was realizing things that I did not realize about the book that were so obvious there. And I think Orwell was a prophet in some sense. And there's a couple main points that I think conservatives miss, which is the whole book is premised on the idea of ubiquitous technology. The whole book.
I don't remember that.
Well, think about it. I mean, a Big Brother in every room, the telescreen in every single room.
Yeah.
The capacity to surveil and control is made easier thanks to technology. And so that's the overarching unspoken takeaway from the book, is that Orwell did not write 1984 in 1284. That tyranny would not have been possible. And so for a kind of thought exercise, what would Napoleon have done if he had the technology at his disposal? And also something I think that is completely missed on the scholarship on the conservative side is, so why do you think that the worst death tolls you've ever seen were in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s? Well, they say the rise of collectivism, despotism, and authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I agree with all of that. It's also technology that could kill more people quicker.
Right.
They could surveil people. They could organize you. And so if we as conservatives become these progressive conservatives that are always just apologizing for technology's sake and never talking about the alienation and the potential introduction for tyranny, I find that repulsive.
Where do you think this is going?
I try not to be solely in the predictive business. I can tell you where I think it's going. So here's the question that is, and I don't think anyone's really said it like this. Was 2016 a tremor, an earthquake, or an aftershock? Meaning, was it something before something? When Donald Trump got elected,
Yes.
Was it an earthquake, which is what it's obviously called, or was it an aftershock? I think it's a tremor. I think what we're living through is a 10-year-long tremor of something that's about to happen. I mean, a tremor meaning something that happens before an earthquake,
Yes.
just to kind of give the geological explanation. I think that when historians write this, they'll look at that as the beginning, not the event, of a decade-long reckoning with this kind of pocket technology, the surveillance state, corporate dominance, postmodern secularism, all these different factors putting together. So where is this going? I don't know, but I do know that there is a restlessness among decent people of what to do next. Where is my place in this world? Do I have to always be a slave to these devices? And so, yeah, there's probably going to be a little bit of upheaval because of that.
It feels that way. So you are, among other things, effectively an activist. You mobilize people to do things.
Yes.
So give us some examples. You said decent people are wondering what they can do to fight back against the megalith, whatever this is.
Yeah, the Leviathan, whatever it is.
The forces of repression that are changing the country too fast in the wrong direction. So give us
progress for progress' sake.
Small bore examples that are accessible to the average person that like you can do to make the country better, to make your family safer, to make the world a happier place.
Well, one thing that we're heavily involved in at Turning Point right now is encouraging people to get involved in school board activism.
Yeah.
You're starting to see this pop up organically, and obviously we're in the education space, and so this is something that is very applicable. But we have just decided to allow the school boards to be completely run by these kind of sociopathic, narcissistic activists for so long. So
some of them don't even have kids.
So that's well, right. So they look at themselves as contributing to this revolution, the long march for the institutions.
Right. It used to be like the school board was busybody moms, you know, and maybe they were kind of annoying, but they were sort of vested in the schools. Their kids went there.
Well, they materially had a reason.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
And so that's one thing. And the other thing is this, which is
so like
running for a school board, being aware of your school board, FOIAing your school board, showing up to them, telling your neighbors and your friends and it's kind of this idea of local. And I think that we're over fixated on Congress, which I am less interested in that than I ever have been in my life, because it's the same sort of just speech and then bipartisan consensus to bring more people into the country and bring more plastic and then go declare war on some sovereign country. Right? It's just no matter what, that just ends up being the output, right?
And And it also feels, I couldn't agree with you more, of course, and it's frustrating as hell, but it also feels like Congress, this is another sign that democracy itself is withering, which obviously it is. The average person has less control over his life than ever before. Congress, as the most democratic body, the legislative body, seems way less relevant than it ever has.
That's right. And
less powerful.
In some ways, that's a good thing. In some ways, yeah, I guess it's probably a good thing. I mean, they're trying to do some very dangerous things that would actually disenfranchise localities.
Right.
So that's the real danger. But I'm actually I'm an optimist, Tucker. I think that self-sovereignty and determination is inevitable. I mean, in 1945, there were 55 countries in the world. There's well over 230. The trend is micro-slicing yourself into a smaller way to govern yourself because you think that you have a certain custom or language.
Wait, there were 55 countries at the end of the Second World War?
That's according to Nigel Farage. So I'll have to triple check that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, but let's pretend it's 100.
Right.
Let's just, for argument's sake. Because I never want to say anything that's untrue, but he just said that yesterday on my podcast, and it struck me as so interesting. And it's probably true when you think about it, because it's, the times of Churchill, and they had a heavy dominance
the colonial
in
powers.
India and Southern Africa, right? So
that's
that's
exactly
probably right.
India became three countries,
Yeah.
right? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh.
That's right. So, and Churchill never thought India could work, and we'll see if it does. But the trend is actually towards less global totalitarianism, not more. The trend is that northern Greece is now, I think it's like northern Macedonia, or whatever it is.
Right.
Which is people splicing themselves, which I think is a healthy thing, saying that we can govern ourselves in a better way than it's currently being done. The European project is withering at the vine, and it was an awful idea from the beginning. There are separatist movements happening, which are always demonized by the kind of smear merchants that run our communication channels in our country. So I actually think it's inevitable that people are going to want to grasp things they can control, things that they're familiar with, things that they see. And obviously the critique that is given to us is like, oh, you just want to have, something based on racial identity. We should reject that. Nothing we're saying is based on any of that.
Of course not.
I mean,
but they'll call you, look, if you do something they don't like, you're a racist. I remember the first time someone called me a racist, I was really shocked and horrified by it, because that's an awful thing to be. And it took me years to realize it has no meaning. They don't mean it. They don't care. They are racists by definition. About the sovereignty and people sort of moving to places with like-minded people. The governor of Florida recently, Rick DeSantis, described Florida as West Berlin, as like the free sector of the country. Is that kind of what you're seeing within our borders? Yeah,
we're already seeing the movement of states, I think, is the harbinger of the trend to come. And so where this plays out, we don't know. That's just guessing. I don't like guessing, but an educated guess would be this trend is always only going to continue. And this is a provocative thing to say, but I'll say because it's true. Outside of a unified currency, what do people like us have in common with people in Brooklyn and San Francisco? Very little. Now, not to say we should break up the United States. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just asking a question that is true. And if you don't have those ties that bind you together, and they reject almost everything that we've talked about, which is preserving ancestral traditions and the beautiful and the good and rooting yourself to permanence and rejecting for progress' sake, then who knows how that's going to shake out. But yeah, I think that what Ron DeSantis said is probably very true.
How can you live with people with whom you have nothing in common and with whom you're at odds over the basic questions? I mean, that's kind of...
And the ironic thing is our leaders created this.
I know.
Which is they could have, after the Soviet Union fell, not sought momentary pleasure and corporate dominance, but said, you know what, we beat the Soviet Union largely because we won the theological debate, which really is what the Soviet Union versus the United States was all about.
Yeah. And we were an effective industrial power.
Of course.
We made more and better stuff.
Yes. And we had factories that were producing steel in Ohio, and we could turn around an aircraft carrier in a month. I mean, it was the envy of the world. And so then our leaders, Ted Kennedy, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, through those kind of 4 public policy decisions that we talked about, completely reverse course. I think we're just finally realizing the consequences of that almost 20 to 30 years later.
So you feel hopeful?
I'm optimistic, of course.
You're 27. This is my last question for you, Charlie Kirk. You're 27. you're a living advertisement for skipping college, I will say, for,
thank
for
you.
a gap year that extends.
That's my next book, by the way.
Good.
Which is encouraging people not to go to college.
I've tried it with my own 4 children. Hasn't worked yet. But anyway, so you've done all this stuff. You've evolved as smart people do. Smart people derive their views from watching the world around them empirically, and you have done that, and I think it's a sign of wisdom. So, where are you going to be in 20 years?
Hopefully, happy and cheerful and with a big family. That's what matters.
Do you want to run?
No, I don't. No,
You're around politicians all the time. You don't want to be one.
Few of them have joy.
Yeah,
and they're never content with where they're at. It's always the next thing, the next office. And it's just kind of a busybody exercise in DC or whatever. I find joy in hosting my radio show, in speaking on college campuses and doing our podcasts and being able to take 2 hours just to read a good book. That's kind of who we are as people. And I think that's an important thing that we shouldn't lose. And so who knows where I'll be, but hopefully I'll be happy and joyful and learning something new every single day.
So if you could isolate the source of your joy in your work, you've already spoken of your family and your relationship to God. But as a professional matter, what brings you joy in what you do day to day?
The highest level of joy or of purpose is when I get thousands of emails or people come up to me, they said, Charlie, you've helped make sense. You've helped clarify my understanding of this particular issue. Thank you. That's the best thing I could possibly hear, is that the work that I am doing, the scholarship I'm trying to endeavor on, the ideas I'm trying to distill and synthesize are making thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, and God willing, millions of people better understand how they fit in this entire political discourse or this cultural conversation. And then, of course, the thing that also gives me great joy is the conversion stories.
Yeah.
Is the people that say, I was, a left-wing socialist, and now I'm a social conservative. And I still believe some of the stuff on economics on the left, but I think that we need to preserve order and this idea of the American nation. It's a great thing to hear.
You thought about, the universities are obviously not sustainable in their current form. They just don't, they don't serve a purpose.
Massive subsidy.
They're, the wellspring of all poison, really, I would say, in this country. So you can't imagine they're going to exist. Is Bowdoin really going to still, be operating in 20? No.
Wellesley.
I hope not. So why wouldn't you work to replace that? You'd like to teach, you said.
That's a very heavy endeavor. Maybe. There's some good schools. Hillsdale does a great job amongst others, but maybe that's not the model that we should encourage. I don't know. Maybe, liberal arts education is very important. I would argue that a good, robust diet of easy to understand, digestible ideas with muscular work is probably more important than just putting 20 million people a year into kind of this factory of indebtedness and lack of purpose, where only 57% of the people that go to college graduate and they're borrowing money they don't have to study things that don't matter, to find jobs that don't exist. So we're filled with awful ideas and sent back into the world. So, maybe there's going to be a place for that. But I also, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about kind of indicting college is that you're just not allowed to talk about it. And almost everyone tap dances around it, which I think is the most exciting of ideas to talk.
Well, maybe that's the answer to the question. The real joy comes from telling the truth when you're not allowed.
That's true. And I will say that. Someone said, Charlie, what does success look like in 5 years? I say, if I can decline college enrollment by 10%, I will have done my job.
Charlie Kirk, thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.